Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 12 transfer plans. And first, of course, we will be doing a Game Week 11 team review. And let's just have a look at my team that got 21 points between 11 players. Technically 12 when you consider Erling Haaland was captained. 2 players on 0 points. 3 players on 1 points. Gordon, who actually was the saving grace of this team, maybe not even deserving to score his goal. I did consider, even on Twitter, I posted a tweet about whether some people were considering to play Gordon Archer because I was actually a bit undecided. And as it turns out, Archer outscored probably 4 to 5 players my teams combined. And yeah, that was game week 11. So I think it's a nice week to sort of look at this result and swiftly move on. It was ultimately probably a 110% red arrow, dropped from around 25k to 54, 55k right now. So I'm not too upset about it ultimately. It's a result that's obviously awful, but I feel like going forwards, there are going to be better weeks. A lot of these players have good fixtures, and there are 2 injuries, of course, to assess, right? If we're being serious, we're being rational. I think Porro still looked great. Honestly, don't really seem concerned about his position in my team. Tsimikas, a little bit concerning, obviously, since he actually started on the bench, but we'll see what happens in the Brentford game. I'm tempted to think that I can maybe react after the Europa League sort of XI that Liverpool play. If he's on the bench there, maybe it's the case that he gets to start the next fixture. However, if he does start that Europa League fixture, I'm a little bit concerned overall with his minutes in the Brentford game, and maybe he'll actually sit on the bench. Now, I also have to assess the Cash injury because, of course, he was taken off, but also he had a pretty bad game. So we've seen many times this season where a manager like, let's say, Eric Ten Hag, for example, will say a player has been injured, so to speak, such as Lisandro Martinez, but in reality, he's just had a bad half of football. For Cash, I feel like that was one of those instances. So it might be the case that he's back on the field to play Fulham at home, and I can probably assess appropriately based on what Unai Emery says, and also whether he's on the bench in his own Europa League fixture, and move on from there. As far as the midfield, I think Gordon honestly looks incredible value for money. You're now looking at a player who actually covers some of the center forward minutes, right? When, let's say, Almiron's off the field, when Wilson's off the field, Gordon has been seen to be moving in there, and that's why he got that goal versus Arsenal. I'm not going to talk about whether the goal was deserved or not, but it did happen. And of course, this is what you want to have in terms of a player who's 5.7 million. On the other hand, of course, Cole Palmer was incredible again, although once again very fortunate, I suppose, with some of the sort of consequences in that Spurs game. And he himself got an insane haul in a tough fixture, right? Spurs away, where you really wouldn't expect for him to get that much value out of that game, but he did. And he's obviously one transfer who's going to be on our minds, as I said, down the radar, but we don't really need to overreact to Cole Palmer, in my opinion. As far as, let's say, Salah, Son, Haaland, and even Saka, these are all players that I think we can keep for the time being. We do obviously have to assess what's going on with Maddison, because that will have some impacts on Son as well. But he himself had some great chances, even in a game when he was playing 9 versus 11. Porro was so close to even assisting Bentancur in that 9 versus 11 when he created a set piece late in the game. And maybe actually with Maddison out, he will be enabled as well. More set pieces. Saka, on the other hand, has been very, very quiet as of late, and it does feel like a bad hold, but you also have to look at the fixture and be positive. It's Burnley at home. No need to overreact. On the other hand, in terms of my bench, when I look at it, as I said, I think there are a lot of defenders who have iffy minutes. However, I think I'll still be playing Gabriel no matter what. I'll have Archer on the bench, hoping that he'll just come on as the first bench option. Colwell has a terrible fixture because he's versus City, and I am a little bit concerned about his sort of performance in that fixture. He definitely showed a strong lack of maturity when he was playing 10 versus 11, getting himself drawn into a yellow card at the 45th minute and being an instant substitute for Cucurella. That's not screaming great value for a player who we previously thought was absolutely nailed in this Chelsea team. And I hope that, of course, this was sort of a punishment in a sense, and that's something that he can work on because he's actually showed some anger management issues this season. And I don't think this is a joke, right? We've seen it. And I do think Pochettino will react to that as well. He's shown the propensity to bench big players like Chilwell. Why wouldn't he bench Colwell if he's not happy with his performances going forwards? As far as the Aston Villa team, yes, of course, a calamitous result. But I think it's worth sort of looking at it from the context of, for example, let's say even the Liverpool result versus Luton, where both teams, of course, huge overdogs, 2 teams expected to win away from home. ultimately underperformed. But when you look at the chances that Forest scored 2 out of the box shots, and of course one huge mistake from Emmy Martinez, when you look at, let's say, Luton, who of course actually, were good value for 1 goal, but of course should have conceded maybe 2 or 3. I think we don't need to overreact necessarily to Liverpool and Aston Villa. I think, of course, with Aston Villa, the reality is that fixtures get worse around Game Week 13 onwards. Game Week 14 is a nice fixture if you want to keep them, but of course, two out of those 3 players from this Aston Villa team, in my opinion, will be transfers out by Game Week 13. And I'm not really opposed to the idea of, let's say, going out of Matty Cash on Game Week 12 so that I can move into another player for the short term. The issue, I suppose, that I have is I don't have the opportunity to go from Cash to, let's say, like someone like Saliba, who is a great fixture. So it's an opportunity, in my opinion, to maybe go for a Newcastle defender, someone like Lascelles or someone like Livramento, who, based on the Dan Burn injury, should get a lot of minutes going forwards. Because we saw, for example, what happened when Dan Burn was taken off. We saw Trippier move to the left back position and then Livramento playing on the right back position. Livramento so far has actually been much better than Lewis Hall in some of the cup fixtures that they've played. In fact, he's been man of the match twice in the AFL Cup compared to Lewis Hall, who also was quite an early substitute in the game versus Man United. So I do think that Eddie Howe definitely has a lot more faith in Livramento. The question, of course, is whether there is good value for Newcastle to play both of them, right? Lewis Hall and Livramento. And maybe that's a question mark to sort of be asked with watching the Champions League game that Newcastle will be involved in and then reacting and reassessing. Lascelles feels nailed, but of course we don't know exactly when Botman is coming back. I do have, of course, the fixture in mind where if you go to someone like Lascelles and I have, let's say, 5 defenders or 4 defenders right on top of him, even if he becomes a dud player, so to speak, I still think he's got good value. The question, I suppose, also is, if I go for Livramento, is that upside worth it, right? It's very similar to the play for moving towards Lascelles, where of course I'd be expending an additional 0.3 million, but he could also be a player who doesn't play consistently enough. I do think that he'll probably play the Bournemouth game, and maybe that's enough value from Livramento to sort of be gleaned from him, but we'll see what happens there. That's the transfer on my mind. As far as Diaby, we've always talked about how he's going to be a transfer out for Mbeumo on Game Week 13 or 14, so I will definitely be executing that transfer then. I know, of course, it's going to be Mbeumo versus Arsenal compared to, let's say, Diaby, who is a tough fixture himself, versus Spurs. But at this point in time, I also have a lot more faith in Mbeumo generally as a player than Diaby. And no surprise, of course, that this week Mbeumo continued to find ways and avenues to points, of course, in a home fixture versus Diaby, who was playing in a relatively easier away fixture. So that is something in my mind. Although, actually, sorry, I wouldn't say necessarily relatively easier, but you get the context with home versus away. As far as, let's say, Watkins, I do think a lot of people are being concerned over Watkins and Salah in the last 2 game weeks. I wouldn't be overly concerned. Ultimately, he got some great chances. I remember John McGinn cross from the left-hand side that was very, very good value for Watkins. And you just have to sort of react to this and say that bad game weeks happen, that bad results happen for Aston Villa as well. And Watkins, of course, has been overperforming, but his underlying stats aren't anything indicative of a player who, has been not good value for his sort of price point, right? Ultimately, Watkins has really, really good underlying stats, and I don't think I'm overly concerned about his blanks. So when we have Fulham at home, I think we don't need to overreact. Yes, of course, Darwin's looked great, but he's, of course, been unclinical with finishing as per usual. As far as Alvarez, you're also looking at a player who doesn't have the best fixtures, but could easily be a transfer out when Watkins is done with his good fixtures. So I think with Watkins, let's say, I would probably consider moving Watkins out on 15 probably, because Aston Villa have a good fixture on 14, and if I, let's say, move Cash and Diaby before 13, either on 12/13 individually, then I will obviously have the opportunity to move Watkins into, once again, a Darwin or Alvarez on 15, but I wouldn't jump the gun necessarily if you're a Watkins owner. Now, of course, if you're someone who owns Solanke or some other forward that you really want to get disposed of and you want to move into Darwin or Alvarez, I think that's completely justified. That's fine, but just keep in mind, of course, this is the context. In terms of Archer, I think when we look at next week, it's actually a good fixture for him on paper because this Brighton defense has been calamitous. Now, of course, Sheffield United are also a diabolical team when it comes to attack, and they are the worst Premier League attack so far. But we don't need to necessarily overreact. I mean, he's just a bench player, and I'm not too disappointed with having to play him next week. But right, going back to the fantasy here for next week, I think right now, I think Cash will probably play, but we'll see, of course, what Unai Emery gives us in terms of updates. We saw Haaland in training as well, so I do think he'll play. No concerns there. As far as my captaincy is concerned, I think I might actually captain Saka and probably vice captain Salah. That's my initial thoughts, and I think I'm just going to keep it like so. Pedro Porro, I think, is really good value. I would probably equate him to Tsimikas because Brentford are actually quite a good attack. Fulham, they have been a decent attack, but of course, still very, very clearly firmly in the bottom half. And so therefore, I think Gabriel's a lot better than Tsimikas and definitely a lot better than Cash. The question, I suppose, is Cash versus Tsimikas, and that's something that I'll have to decide later this week. And those are my sort of general transfer plans. And as I said, if I want to move out of any of these players, I do think Livramento is on my radar. So is Lascelles. So those are transfers that I could make on top of, let's say, transfers there. Of course, if let's say Haaland is injured, a lot of people will be asking the question, if I've got 2 free transfers, what can I do with the Viking? And what I would probably suggest, of course, is maybe, be open to the idea of maybe going Alvarez or Darwin, and getting someone in the defensive positions or the midfield positions that you can upgrade. But in reality, I do think it seems like more than likely Haaland's going to be completely safe. And honestly, if Haaland was only out for the Chelsea fixture, in my position, right, as someone with 1 free transfer only, I would not consider transferring Haaland out. I think transfers are very important. I will have other issues in my team, as is already the case. Colwill, Tsimikas, Cash, all their minutes are suspicious. Even Gabriel, for example. So I've got 4 defenders who have got question marks all over, and it's not really worth expending transfers on Haaland for 1 week to know that I'm taking out an absolute monster of a player for 1 week, and knowing that I will have other issues that I have to sort of address that I won't be able to address without a free transfer. So those are my thoughts. And Turner, for example, is included in that category just simply because Areola has a good fixture, right? So those are my initial thoughts. I wouldn't touch Haaland personally. Now, in terms of Palmer, I would definitely not overreact. In terms of Gordon, I think if you want to move into Gordon, you can definitely consider it, but keep in mind, of course, that some of these fixtures are tough. Now, if you don't plan on expending a transfer whatsoever, then of course, maybe Gordon would make sense. But I do think there will be games in the future where he's not going to be a 90-minute player. He's not going to be covering those center forward minutes. He can still be someone who can be subbed off, right? It's not like Gordon is the golden boy in a sense for this Newcastle team. He isn't going to play every single minute possible. If he, for example, expends himself and plays 90 minutes in the Champions League, it's very likely the case that he starts the Bournemouth fixture, but maybe won't play the full 90, which of course is going to be bad value. And then we have to reconsider, of course, simply he could be a transfer out for Palmer. So those are my sort of thoughts in the medium to long term in terms of my assets. Once again, no plans to really take Salah or Son out of my team until AFCON comes around. As I said, Diaby's a placeholder for Mbumo. And of course, I think the priority transfer once again this week is probably defender transfers. We've also got Crystal Palace defenders that we can think about too. Players like Anderson or Guehi or even Mitchell who've done well so far. I wouldn't really think about spending the amount of money on Anderson. I do think he's a little bit overpriced. Yes, of course, when you look at the points, it does seem very juicy to go into a player who's gotten that many points, but we also have to check how realistic were the avenues to points. With a player like Trippier, who actually amasses something like 0.5 expected assists per game, that's normal. That's expected for him to be the number 1 FPL asset in the game. However, with Anderson, who doesn't have anything close to those defensive underlying stats, I would not be too concerned about spending that additional 0.5 over, let's say, someone like Mitchell for Anderson. So for that reason, I think maybe if you're, let's say, going for a Crystal Palace defender this week, why not just go for Mitchell? Because Guehi himself has gotten a price rise to 4.6. So that's something on my mind. I think we don't need to overreact. Probably Crystal Palace or Newcastle defender transfer this week and continue to live life. If you own Dan Burn, I think you're in the same camp. Either you sort of reassess and move into another Newcastle defender, or once again consider a Crystal Palace defender. I think as far as Tsimikas, we probably can't overreact. Unfortunately, there's no one at that price point at Liverpool who gives us that access to the Liverpool defense, who of course are still prone to making mistakes. They're not the sort of iron wall that I suppose Newcastle is, but this is the landscape in FPL. I think we don't need to overreact. I've had a terrible game week. My team was terrible. Let's just reminisce and have a look at the 21 and just stare down this beautiful honking team. And yeah, I think we just continue to move on with good decisions in FPL. Know that we've made picks and for certain players who are supposed to last us multiple game weeks. One bad game week is probably not going to sway my mind. We know how fast FPL swings, and the team still looks relatively good, relatively in shape compared to some of the players who unfortunately are dealing with much more severe injuries. And so I'm going to leave it like that in terms of my FPL team for now. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys haven't done so already, please feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. Around 50% of our viewers are unfortunately not subscribed to the channel. Otherwise, I hope you guys had much better game weeks than me, much more points than me, and are enjoying FPL a little bit more than me this week. But otherwise, as I said, I'll see you guys for the next videos, and take care and goodbye.